Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma daf tzadivav. Today's daf is sponsored by Art Gould in loving memory of Art's father, Joseph, Yosef and Shlomo Shabtai Rachel, and his 23rd yahrzeit. Joe was an ordinary man of extraordinary dignity, decency, and dedication. When my mother first saw him, she was immediately interested. Then he removed his hat. She saw his bald head and concluded that he was already married with children. He wasn't. The rest is family history. Joe is not one of those lucky people who found what they love and never worked a day in his life. Instead, his career was bring home a paycheck and support his family. I wish we had more time together. Today's daf is sponsored by Harriet Hartman, in loving memory of her parents, Fruma, Florence, Bat Esther Ben Nachum Natan, and Baruch Ben Hinda Josepha Ze'ev Stillman, whose yahrzeits are only 4 days apart in Shvat. They always encouraged me to pursue whatever interested me and supported me with unfailing love. Their love, solidarity, stability were models to all of my children, despite the geographical difference in most of our everyday lives. I broadened their horizons as they enabled my horizons to be broadened. They're beautiful dedications. 2 quick announcements before we start. Number 1, Rabbanit Yafi Kleimer's Shiur, Machshava Shniya and Second Thought is up on about really it's a little bit of comparing Gzela and Gneva, which we saw at the end of the 7th chapter, and really talking about the idea behind why theft is taken so seriously in halakha, how bad it is for society, and some ideas behind that. And the second thing is that we are starting the Megillah challenge. This is mainly really not for Daf Yomi learners, although anyone who is learning Daf Yomi and already learned Megillah or didn't learn Megillah and wants to learn Megillah, it's a 31-day challenge to basically learn Megillah during the month of Adar Rishon, to finish it, all of Masechet Megillah before Purim. And the challenge is geared toward 2 different audiences. One is an audience of people who, let's say, are interested in learning but don't want to commit exactly to Daf Yomi. So it's for people like that. So you can spread it around to people and kind of get a taste of learning and what it's like to have daily learning. That's number 1. And also we're doing programs in high school. So if any of your high school teachers and interested in promoting these programs in your school, we're also trying to encourage young learners to get started with learning. Megillah is a great way to start and get excited about learning Limud Lishma within high school classes. So if anyone is interested or knows of high schools that are interested, you can have them communicate with us about it and get their goals on board. It doesn't require a lot of work on part of the teachers because all the shiurim are provided by us. The idea would be do a siyum at the end, have a nice way to celebrate the learning, and perhaps some livoy here, some guidance here and there. Okay, with that, you can find more details on our website. We're going to get started now with where we ended. We started, let's go back a little bit. We had this statement that Rav Nachman quoted in the name of Shmuel. And what we're going to see in the beginning of today's daf is a whole bunch of contradictory statements of Shmuel, and we're going to have to reconcile them all and say there must be different circumstances in different cases. So we start with this case that Rav Nachman said there's 3 people who, when they collect land from someone, we evaluate how much the person who they're collecting from enhanced the land. The person who collected from them has to give back the enhancement to them, but not in land, but in money, okay? Meaning they just give them the value. They take all the land. So let's just talk about the main case that we're going to focus on now, which is the Baal Chov Lelokeh. If Ruth lent money to Naomi, and Naomi now has to pay her back, but Naomi has no money left, and Naomi already sold her land to Yael. So Ruth now goes to collect from Yael the field. That's the basic law of lien property. So it's not Yael's loan, it's Naomi's loan. Ruth goes to Yael. Now Yael had invested in that property. So that property started off at 100 and now it's worth 150. So what happens? Ruth takes 150 and she has to pay back Yael the 50 that Yael invested in it, because Yael bought the land for 100, invested in it 50. She has to return the 50 to Yael, but not in the land. Okay, the easy way to do the land would be split it into thirds. 2/3, which was 100, go to Ruth, and 1/3 of it, valued at 50, goes to Yael. But no, Yael doesn't get to keep the land, but she does get the enhancements back. She gets it in money. That's basically what we learned. Same thing with a Bechor and a Pashut and a Baal Chov and a Yatom. I don't want to go back to those right now. Amalei Ravina leRavashi. Mi amar Shmuel Baal Chov lelokech yav leSheva. So he's going to ask about that case. Does Shmuel really hold that? Now, there's a few elements here. One is that the Baal Chov has to give back the enhancements. And the other is, but not in land, but in money. So first, our question is going to focus on the first part. the Baal Chov has to give back the enhancements to Yael. So now, the buyer. Does Shmuel really say that the enhancements have to go back? Ha'amar Shmuel Baal Chov goveh hashevach. Didn't Shmuel say that the Baal Chov collects the extra money also? They get the enhancements. That seems a little strange, but that's what he says. So how do we reconcile it? Amar lei. So Rav Ashi answers Ravina and says, Lo kasha. Kam b'shevach ha'megia l'ktefayim, kam b'shevach she'enu megia l'ktefayim. There's different types of enhancements. Depends at what stage of the growth those enhancements are at. So let's say Yael plants the field, and they're growing in the field, but they're not yet megia l'ktefayim. That means, okay, let's talk about what megia l'ktefayim is. It means when the fruits are already fully grown and almost ready to be picked, okay, close to being ready to be picked. If there's a field full of produce that's almost ready to be picked, well, then Yael can demand that back. Okay, she could say, hey, look, they were almost ready to be picked, give it back to me. But if they were just in their growing stage, that is considered secondary to the field. And since Ruth gets the field, she gets the enhancements also. So now we're going to say, when Shmuel said in the beginning, the statement that Rav Nachman quoted, when he said that basically she has to give back the enhancements, that's in a case where it was already fully grown. And the case where it says the Baal Chov gets to keep the enhancements, that's when the enhancements are secondary to the field, and they're basically considered part of the field. But that's not going to be satisfactory enough, because the Gemara asks, we're still at the bottom of Tzadi Hamubet. But forget about what Shmuel holds. We see this going on all the time. Okay, Masim b'chol yom, that's an exaggeration, but on a daily basis, what they're basically saying, I don't know daily, but it happened probably at least a number of times, that Shmuel collected, in other words, meaning Shmuel ruled in his court that people can collect even shevach ha'megia l'ktefayim. That means that when Ruth goes to collect the field that she's owed, that Naomi now sold the field to Yael, she gets to take the field with all the shevach, even if it's produce that's about ready to be cut. So Amar le lo kasha. So that was a question again that Ravina threw back at Rav Ashi. And Rav Ashi says that's also not a problem. I have an answer for everything. What's his answer? Hadim masik be kashiur ara ushvacha. Hadim lo masik ba ela kashiur ara. Well, it really all depends, which is kind of obvious, on how much the loan was for and how much the land is worth. If the land that Naomi sold to Ruth was worth 100, like we said, and then Yael enhanced it, and it's now worth 150, well, it really depends how much money Ruth is owed. If Ruth is owed 150, okay, that means masik be kashiur ara ushvacha. Ruth was owed the amount of money of the land plus the enhancements. So basically, if Ruth was owed 150, this is kind of obvious, then, and the land now with this produce that's about to be picked is worth 150, well, of course, Ruth could collect the whole thing. Because even though Yael only bought a field of 100 from Naomi, it was only a field of 100 that was leaned, but since the loan was for 150, right? In other words, you could say right there, she must have more fields, but either way, it's still, basically, she got this field that was leaned, and now she made it worth 150, well, Ruth could collect the entire thing. And hadalom asik be'ela kashiur ara, but if the loan was only for 100, then that's where we said that if it's megia l'ktefayim, if it's already about to be picked, then Ruth would have to compensate Yael, again, not in land, but in money. So now let's go back to that case. Now we're going to have a question on that case. So assuming that the loan was only for 100, Ruth has to give back Naomi to Yael, the value of the 50 that she took, not in land, but in money. So now we're going to question that element of it. First, we question the first part. How did she even collect it? So we explained it really depends on the situation. Now we're going to say, Amarle, well, there's two approaches, two different opinions about how this works in general. When Ruth can go collect from, again, it's Naomi's loan, but Naomi sold her land to Yael. Now, Yael knew when she bought it, you always have to remember this, otherwise it makes no sense. Yael knew that the property was liened to a loan. She knew, basically, it doesn't mean this property in particular, it just means property in general of Naomi's is liened to the loan. Any property that Naomi sells after the date of the loan is liened to the loan. So Yael knew this going in when she bought it. So she knew she was buying it with some risk. That's why she knows Ruth can take it. But when she enhances it, she thinks, right, I can enhance it and I'll get it. Okay, and then that all depends on how much the loan was for, etc. But The question is, when Ruth shows up at Yael's doorstep and says, hey, pay up, this land, right, I'm owed from Naomi and you bought it from her, I'm taking this land. The question is, can Yael pull out her wallet and give her the money in cash if she has it? And does Ruth have to take it? Or can Ruth insist on the land? Because let's try to remember what happened here. Naomi borrowed money, cash. It wasn't a deal about land. She borrowed money, but she didn't have the money to pay. Now, when you don't have the money to pay, they could take it from your land. If your land was sold, they could take it from the land that was sold. But the question is, since Naomi could have paid with money, perhaps Yael can pay with money. And that's a debate. So now they say the following. The fact that Ruth doesn't give her land, but pays her the enhancements in money is only going to work with one opinion here. Amarle. So Ravina says, another question. If you hold that Yael cannot give money instead to Ruth, when Ruth comes and says, hey, you bought property that was liened, I'm taking the property away. If Yael has to give her the land, then this all makes sense. Why? In other words, they're not the same thing. But then let's just think about it. If Ruth has rights, sole rights to the land, right? And Yael has nothing to say about it. She can't give her money instead. Then it makes sense that Ruth will take the land, including the enhancements. And when she pays her back the enhancements, all she has to do is compensate her with money. Okay? If you don't understand this, you'll see the reverse, and then you'll understand why they're saying this is obvious. It's obvious. But let's see the other side. Ella lemanda amal. But if you hold, because again, there's a debate about this issue. If Yael had the money to pay back Naomi's loan, again, Naomi doesn't have the money and Naomi doesn't have land. So they go instead, right? The first thing you do is check if Naomi has money, but Naomi doesn't have money. So then you see, does she have land? No, she sold it already. So now if you go to Yael, logic would state this actually makes a lot of sense. The Yael can say, here's money, take the money and leave me with the land. Now, if you hold that she could do that, then what we said here doesn't make sense. Because why? Le male. So now it's a different case, but it's analogous. Now, in this case, she happens not to have the money, and that's why Ruth takes her land. So Ruth takes her land, including the enhancements. But if she could pay money instead of Ruth taking the land, and even though now she doesn't have money, she could claim le male. If I had the money, I would kick you off of the entire land. You wouldn't be able to take any of this land from me. I bought it. I have money to pay for Naomi's loan. Take the money and walk away. And therefore, hashta, now that I don't have the money, and you're taking my field, but the whole loan was only for 100. This field is now worth 150. So, havli griva da'ara shiur shvache. Give me 1/3 of the land to keep. If she could push her off with money, then theoretically she could say, I'll push her off with taking only 2/3 of the land. Once she takes 2/3 of the land, you shouldn't have it that, according to this logic, it makes no sense. And if you hold by this position, it makes no sense that Ruth can take all the land and only has to pay Yael back in money. Yael should have the rights to say, if she has the rights to say, take money and leave me with the land, then she has rights to say, take 2/3 of the land and leave me with 1/3. Okay, or whatever the percentage might be. In our case, it was 2/3, 1/3. So that doesn't really make any sense. So we're back with another problem here with what we said. So Amrale, to which Rav Ashi answers, now we're going to say that the case is not what we thought it was. It wasn't just a typical case where Naomi owed Ruth money. And then she sold some land to, some random land she sold to Yael, and then the land gets collected from Yael. No, it was a case where the land was in a potiki. We learned this word before. I'll remind you what it means. It means that when Naomi took out the loan with Ruth, she said to her, you will collect from this land. I am giving you this land, okay? Not, I have 5 fields, not any one of the 5 fields. This field is designated for your collection. If she does that, and then Naomi sells that to Yael, and Ruth collects the field from Yael, she has full rights to collect from that field, even if, in that case, for sure, nobody thinks that Yael can push her off with money. There's no chance because it was in a potiki. And a potiki is a different story because it's so clearly designated. To Amrale, what is an apotiki? They say now, lo yehe lecha piraon ela mizeh. You are only going to to collect from this field. Then Yael has no rights whatsoever to say, give me a part of the land. So then we'd have to go back and read that first line of Rav Nachman and Shmuel. There's 3 people who get the shevach. They could take the shevach, but they have to return the shevach in money. That's only in the case of an apotiki. If you hold, again, there's 2 tracks. If you hold that Yael can't offer her money anyway, then it doesn't make a difference. Then it doesn't have to be a case of apotiki. But if you hold that Yael can offer money instead, then this case would only be in the case of an apotiki. So there's 2 tracks of answering that question. Okay, or it's not even really a question according to the first understanding. It's only a question according to the second. Okay, Amalava. So that was the first part of today's stuff, which was dealing with all sorts of contradictions within Shmuel. We distinguished between if the produce is about to be picked or if it wasn't about to be picked, right? If it's not about to be picked, it's canceled to the land, and then it's not really viewed so much as an enhancement. And then that goes. Or we then distinguish even if it is ready to be picked, but if it was part of the amount that was owed in the loan, then she could collect the whole thing, right? And doesn't have to give back money at all to Yael. In other words, by the way, obviously Yael goes back to Naomi and says, hey, she took the land, you got to compensate me. But Ruth can collect the whole thing from her. And then we distinguish between what we just did about whether Yael could pay her money or not. And then we had to explain in 2 different ways. Now we're going to move on to the idea of the gazlan. Okay, let's just read and then we'll explain. Amar Rava, gazal v'hishpiach umachal, gazal v'hishpiach v'horish. Now, let's just talk about gazal v'hishpiach. Until now, we've been talking about this topic for a while now, from yesterday, that if you steal and then invest, so the investment goes to, now we had a debate about this. This was Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon. Our Mishna, which seemed to go by Rabbi Yehuda, said you get all of the shevach, because that's the whole takanat shavim. We want to encourage thieves to repent. So anything you invested, you get to keep. You don't have to return the item as is to the original owner. You've acquired it, right? There has to be some sort of shinoi, but you've acquired it. And if you've invested in it, right, you get to keep the investment and you return it at its value at the time you stole it. Then we have this other thing, which is Rabbi Shimon said, you actually return the enhancements, but you get a percentage of them because, like any shepherd, right? If you work with someone else's sheep, you split like a sharecropper type thing. So if you enhanced it, you get a percentage. We said, right? The lemechza l'shlisha l'revia, either half, a third, a quarter, depending on what the customary thing is. So whether Rava's issue here is referring to the percentages that the gazlan gets, or whether it's talking that's according to Rabbi Shimon, or whether it's talking according to Rabbi Yehuda, this basic takanat shavim, that you're always going to get all of the shevach goes to the thief. That's a subject of debate. Like Rashi suggests, maybe he's talking about this, or maybe he's talking about that. That's just the background here about what he's referring to. Rashi suggests both possibly. In any case, in a case where the thief gets to keep the shevach, okay, whether it's Rabbi Yehuda or whether he gets to keep just percentages according to Rabbi Shimon, but now we're talking about either the whole amount or part of the amount, it doesn't make a difference. Then he sells it to somebody else. Now what we're basically saying is, if the gazlan increased the value, so he stole it at 100, now it's 120, and he sells it at 120 to somebody else. And then at the gazlan, the nigzal takes it back from not the thief, but takes it back from the one who he sold it to, or gazal v'shpiach b'olish, or he passed it on his inheritance, and now it's not him anymore, it's his sons. So basically, since he sold his rights. So since the gazlan would have got to keep the enhancements himself, therefore, when he sold it to someone else, they get to keep the enhancements that the gazlan himself invested in. So basically, if the person who got stolen from goes and collects the item, right, the animal, let's say, he collects it only at 100. He has to compensate the person the extra 20 that the thief himself had increased in value. But comes Rava now asks, we're going to have a slew of questions. Rava, what if the shevach, the enhancements, didn't happen in the hand of the gazlan? Now you have to put on a certain, I like to say, glasses to read the sugya to understand it. Now you would think a gazlan's a pretty bad guy, and if a gazlan would get the extra, then obviously someone who buys it who wasn't really, right, maybe didn't know it was stolen, didn't do anything wrong, or the heirs that just inherited it, of course they would get shevach. If any enhancement that they do, they would get as well. But Rava is looking at it from a different perspective. And to understand that, you have to think about what's going on here. This whole thing was instituted. It's a little easier to understand according to Rabbi Yehuda, that it's all takanat shavim. It's all a takana to encourage the thief to do tshuva. So what do we say? Really, the item belongs to the person who it was stolen from. And really, they should get back the whole amount. But because we want to encourage the gazlan to do tshuva, if he enhanced it, he gets to keep the enhancements, because otherwise he'll never want to give it back. He'll say, I invested in this. Why am I going to return it? But if it's already in the hands of somebody else and they invest in it, well, there is no takanat shavim. They don't need to repent. They didn't do anything wrong. So that's what his question is. If the lokach then enhances, so again, it's worth 100, the gazlan sells it or dies, and it's still worth 100. And the person who buys it from the gazlan, or the person who inherited it, now enhances the value. So is the same thing in place as before? Do we say that when the person who got it stolen from takes it back, do the enhancements go to the lokach or not? Does he get to keep them? Well, but hard to buy a hadra pashta. After he asked the question, he now answers it. And he says, look, when the gazlan sells this property, what does he sell? He's basically saying, you're going to be like me. I'm selling you all the rights that I had. I have rights to the enhancements. If I enhance it, I get to keep it. If you enhance it, you get to keep it also. So even though maybe theoretically the concept doesn't apply to them, but it would be the same thing, because their power comes from the person who they bought it from. And if the person they bought it from would get the enhancements, then they should get the enhancements as well. So that we have an answer for. But now we ask another question. We're going to have a question on what the question is at all. By Rava, what if a gentile? Now we assume here it means stole. This is the Rava. There's a debate about who the gentile is here. But let's go back to the original case. He stole, hishbiach. Okay. Now, if he steals, now this whole takanat shavim is to encourage people to repent. So if he's a Gentile, we're not as concerned with the repentance, right? We have a whole different track for Gentiles in our religion, right? Whether take it or leave it, right? We might have some issues with that, but our system is built for Jewish people. So we're not as much concerned, or maybe we are. That's maybe the question. And we're going to see what exactly the question is. So Ravina. Why is Rava asking this question? So now we're going to have a back and forth between Rav Pappa and Ravina to try to figure out what the question is. What, we're going to make a takana to ovdei kochavim. In other words, if a Gentile steals from a Jew, the Gentile can keep the enhancements, even though really the item is the Jews and the Jews should get it all. Why would we make some takana to protect to make it better for the Gentile? That doesn't make any sense. So Ravina says, no, Rava wasn't asking that. What Rava was asking is, we're talking about the Gentile was the thief. And then the thief sold the stolen item to somebody else, a Jew, and the Jew enhanced it. Would that Jew get it or not? To which he says, of course the Jew wouldn't get the enhancements, because what did Rava say in the first place? We said that whoever buys it from the thief is just like the thief. Now, if the thief in this case is a Gentile, and they don't get the proceeds, the enhancements, then, of course, the person who he sells it to gets whatever power he had. So if he didn't have the access to the enhancements, would have to return the item as is, then of course the person who bought it from him would have to return the item as is, even if they increase the value. So he says, no. Okay, I'll explain to you the question then, because they're basically saying the answer is so obvious, can't be Rava asked that question. Lo tzricha kigon de gazal Yisrael v'zabnei nialei v'shpicha ovei kochavim v'hadar ovei kochavim v'zabnei de Yisrael. Okay, the case gets more complicated. It was sold to a Jew. The Jew got rights to the enhancements when they stole it. But the Jew didn't enhance it at all. The Jew sold it to a Gentile, and the Gentile enhanced it. And then the Gentile sold it to a Jew. Now, do we say the Gentile got what the Jew got, which was the rights to the enhancements, and then sold that to the Jew, and then the Jew got the enhancements? Or do we say, right, the first guy was Jewish, and therefore the takana exists, and therefore he's going to pass that on to the final Jew. Or maybe the takana doesn't apply here because there was a Gentile in the middle there. Once it gets into the Gentile's hands, the takana goes out the window. And the answer is teku. We don't know the answer. So we had Rava asked a seemingly simple question, which Rav Pappa and Ravina made a big deal about. It doesn't make sense. He asked this, doesn't make sense. He asked that. They had to say it was obviously some much more complicated case, and there's no answer to the question. Okay, so first Rava started out with something that was basic. Then he asked a question and then answered it. And then he asked another question and there was no answer to the question. It wasn't even clear what his question was. Rav Pappa. Now we're going to have statements of Rav Pappa and Rava, who are going to talk about all sorts of shinuyim. Okay, that's our big topic for this chapter. Shinui is kona, as we've said. You make a change in it, that means it's acquired by you, which means if you steal it and make a change, you only have to return it the way it was at the time of the theft. Right? Obviously, if you don't change it, you have to return it as is. But once you change it, now the question is, what constitutes change? We've been talking about this before. Now we're going to have a whole slew of cases. Mainly, we're going to be talking about what's called shinui shem. If you change something and its name changes, that already makes all the difference. If its name doesn't change, then no. But even with a name change, it's not always going to be significant, and it will depend on whether, I'll already tell you, whether it can be returned to its original state. And when we say return to original state, we're going to see it means exactly as it was in its original state and not somewhat different. So we'll get into all that right now. Rav Pappa. You steal a tree from your neighbor. Okay, you walk into your neighbor's garden. Let's assume it's your next door neighbor. You walk in, you cut down their tree, and even if I take it, let's say we're right on the border there, I cut it down and I move it onto my side. And usually shinoi reshut, moving it into my domain will acquire it for me? No. Okay, we're going to say lo kani, my time. Why not? Because it's still called a palm tree, even though it's detached. Okay, because it's whole and complete, even though it's no longer attached to the ground, it's still called a palm tree. And therefore, I don't acquire it. So then when I return it, I can return it as is. Okay, now, next. If I took this palm tree and I cut it into logs, lo kane, I also don't acquire it because hashtamiat gube de dikle mikre. Now, we call logs, but they apparently call them logs of a palm tree. So because it still has palm tree in its name, that's not called the shinu. Gube vavdinu kishure, but if you take the logs and you turn them into beams, that's already something different. Kishure ravrave, and then you would be kone because it's a new name. This is something different. Kishure ravrave, vavdinu kishure zutre, if you had big beams and then you cut them into smaller beams, lo kane. Big and small, that's not a change in name. It's still called beams. Avdinu kitsutziata, but if you turn it into boards, kane, because beams is not the same as boards. Okay, so as soon as you have a different name, it's kone. Rava, and notice all these changes, by the way, can't go back to what they were originally. So now Rava is going to also talk about similar things. If you steal a lulav, vavdinu hutse, and then you break it into leaves, and now you have just separate leaves from the lulav. So kane to me, kara luliva mikreva hashte hutse. It was originally a lulav, now it's called leaves. Hutse vavdinu chufya. You took the leaves and you turned it into a broom. I don't know if you ever tried to do this with your lulav, but theoretically you can make a broom out of lulav leaves. Kane, you could, because meikara, in other words, you would acquire it, because meikara hutse v'hashta chufya. Again, name change. It was called leaves, now it's called a broom. Chufya v'avde shurshura, but if you took the broom and you weaved it into a rope, some sort of, you took the leaves and you took the broom and undid it and weaved it into a rope, lo kane, my timer, there's such a levavya chufya, because you can undo it and turn it back into a broom, and it would be the exact same thing. So again, it's a different name, but it could be returned to its original state. So that's not a shinoi. That's not kone. By Rav Pappa. Now here comes a really interesting question. Nechleka atiyomet mahu. What if, okay, now you might remember this from Sukkah. If the middle central part, the spine of the lulav splits at the top, there's a debate about whether this is pasul or not. So now we're going to get to something interesting, which is if halakhically, this now turns into a pasul lulav. It's no longer a good lulav. That's already a change. Now, one's a lulav, right? They're both called lulav, but one's a kosher lulav, one's a disqualified lulav. So if it's going to be disqualified, then that's already something different, and that has a different name, which is interesting because it's not really different. It's just halakhically different. So nechlekati yomit ma. What if the top splits there? Tashma, let's learn it from here. Amar Rabbi Matun, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, nitzla atiyomet pasul. If the top part there of the spine is broken off, then, right, taken off, it's disqualified. To which the Gemara, we're moving now to Amud Bet. My lav huadin lenechleka. If it breaks off, Or, right, we assume that means even if it splits, it would be a problem. As soon as the teomet is ruined, so to speak, it would be a problem. In which case, the assumption is, if it's a disqualified lulav, then it's going to be a change if you did that. This isn't talking about on Sukkot. You haven't just steal a lulav and you split the top. Well, it's already a different name because it's a lulav pasul, disqualified. To which they say, lo, no, you misunderstood. That source said if you break off the top, it's no good, but that the middle part, the spine there, but the top of the spine, but nitzla shane, that's much worse. You've taken it off. It's just splitting is not a problem. Some people say, some people have a whole different version of this, and that he actually said, that he didn't just talk about natla, that the statement they quoted said, even, right, nechlaka, and obviously, right, if it gets split, it's as if you took it off, in which case it's disqualified. And if you say it's disqualified, then it's going to be considered a shinoi when it comes to a theft. Rav Pappa, if you took soil or dirt or can't think of the best word to explain it, but you turned it into a brick. Okay, so lo kane, you're not kone. Why not? This is you took earth. Maybe that's a good word. You took earth and you turned it into a brick. Why? That's clearly different. But lo kane, because my time because you can just take apart the brick and turn it back into earth. But levain tava'avda afra kane. But if you took a brick and turned it into earth, now this would be kone. Why? My amar dilma hadar leventa. Couldn't you say, well, you could turn it back into a brick? So they say, very interestingly, hi leventa acharitehu. You're never going to make two of the same bricks, even with the same earth, because it's going to come out a little bit different, shaped a little different, this a little different. Maybe some earth will have fallen out. It won't be the exact same thing. Because it's not the exact same thing, panim chadashot ba'u lekan. It's like something new entirely. And therefore, it's going to be considered a shinoi that can't go back to its original state, because even its original state, it won't be the same. Original state has to be exactly original state. So in one direction, it works, in the other, it doesn't. We're going to see the same case here. Rav Pappa says another case. If you stole a bar of silver, and you turned it into coins, lo kane. Why? My time, you didn't acquire it because hadar avele naska, because you can easily just turn it back into a silver chunk. You can meld it all back together. But zuze avavdinu naska. But if you steal coins and you turn them into a block of silver, then kane, my amart. But why? Hadar avele zuze. Can't you just make them back into coins? No, because the coins will never be exactly identical as they were to the beginning. So because of that. Okay, yes, it is interesting. I wasn't going to talk about it because we don't have a lot of time. But yeah, panim chadashot, we usually know from Sheva Brachot and having new people that weren't at the wedding before. So it's very interesting use of the term here. Okay, last case here. If you had dark ones and you turn them, you had darkened coins over time, right, like silver tarnishes. So you turn them into new coins. Basically, you clean them. Lo kane. That's not a change, even though they look totally different. But that's no change. They're still coins. But if you took new coins and then you blacken them, they got ruined, tarnished, then you are acquiring it. Why? Can't you just clean them again? Okay, for all those who like to polish silver, this is a little bit of a no matter how much you polish them, they're still going to look somewhat blackened. Okay, you're never going to get it all back to the original state. Right? It's one of those frustrations when I polish it, like you keep finding black on it. It doesn't matter how much you polish. Okay, maybe you guys know how to polish better than me. Anyway, zehaklal. So now we're back to the Mishna. The Mishna had all these cases of a change that happened, if you remember, and then the Mishna gave a principle at the end. Now, when you have a principle at the end, doesn't really make so much sense. Why would you have this principle at the end? You already know the rule. So, what's this coming to include? It's coming to include, now this is a bit strange because we're in the Gzela chapter. Remember, we did Geneva already in chapter 7. Now we're in Gzela, but we're going to say that this is teaching us something about Geneva. Okay? So, it's to include what Rabbi Meir said. Now, remember that Rabbi Meir said this is going to come up later in the daf. Ganav talev v'nasa ayil, egav v'nasa shor. Now, we already learned this. If you steal a small animal and then it grows bigger and it changes its name, because animals change their name as they grow. So you steal a lamb and it becomes a ram. You steal an egel, a calf, and then it becomes a shor, it becomes an ox. Naseh shinoi biado ukna. Since it changed name while it was in your possession, you acquired it, which means you only have to return it from the moment of the theft. But not only that, you acquired it also for the fact that there's no liability for tvicha umechira, if you remember. Tabachu machal, if you now slaughter it and sell it, well, since you acquired it, shalohu tovach shalohu mocher, you're not going to be liable to 4 or 5 payment, which again is only for Geneva, not Zela, which is weird that this line is including a Geneva case, but it's saying if it were in the parallel world of Geneva, you wouldn't have the 4 or 5 payment because it's already your own. So if that shinoi happens, it's already yours. How Gavra? Now we're going to have a case, and it's a very kind of funny interchange between Rav Nachman and Rava. There was a guy, the Gazel Padana de Torah Mechaber. He stole a pair of oxen that have a yoke between them, and you can work them together. He stole this pair of oxen from someone. Azo krav bekrava zarabuza, and he used them to plow his field and plant his seeds. L'sof ahadrin elamari. So then he gives it back to the original owner. Ata the kamed Rav Nachman. So they come before Rav Nachman in the court. Amar lehu. Rav Nachman says to them, Zilu, besides returning the oxen, Zilu shumu shvacha de eshbach. Well, this guy enhanced his field, the thief, with using, right now his field is worth more because he plowed it, he planted it, using those animals. So the amount that his field went up should go to the person he stole from. Amar le Rava, tore eshbach, aralo eshbach. Rava says, wait a minute. Let's say he plowed the field, and instead of the field being worth 100, it's now worth 150. You're going to give him all 50 to the guy who stole it? But part of what enhanced it was the field itself. In other words, it's a joint effort of the shvarim, and the fact that he has good soil and all that has nothing to do with the thief's stolen animals. So Amar, so now what happened here? Rav Nachman paskin, and Rava comes and starts questioning his psak. So Rav Nachman is a little bit impatient. He says to Rava, Amar, mikamina nesheminu kulu. I didn't mean he gets all the shevach, the 50. He gets half of it. Half of it is on account of the oxen that did the work, that were stolen, and half of it is on account of the field. So 25 goes to him. I didn't mean the whole thing. Well, Rava still has a question on him. Amalei, suf gzelahu, v'kahadra be'enei. But wait, didn't we learn, why are you giving him the shevach? The shevach doesn't go to him. What did we learn? The gazlan is koneh the chayfetz and only has to return the object. And the Torah says, as the Mishna says, Ditnan, kol gazlanim shamim keshara gzelah. That's what we learned. Now, the value at the time of the theft was 100. It wasn't, right, or whatever. Let's say the oxen are worth 180, okay? He paid 180. Why does he have to pay the extra 25 of what they increased the value of his field? That's not something that goes. So Rav is still bothering about his psak. So now you can see Rav Nachman's really losing it. He says, Didn't I tell you when I judge a case in court, Rav Nachman says to Rava, don't try to criticize me at all. Don't tell me anything. Because Huna and his friends say about me, Ana v'Shavar Malka ache bedina. Me and Shavar Malka were brothers in judgment. Who's Shavar Malka? Shavar Malka is the Persian king. It was like the way we say Pharaoh was, the kings were always called Pharaoh. Okay, that was like the name. It wasn't like a particular Pharaoh, but they're all called Pharaoh. In the Persian kingdom, they were all called Shavar Malka. So Shavar Malka was the Persian king. They were living under the Persian rule. And what he's saying is, me and the Persian king are brothers indeed, meaning just like the king rules and everyone takes his ruling, likewise me. The problem is that it's a little bit weird. Why is he connecting himself to Shavar Malka? And in fact, there's a sugya in Bava Batra that says there's Shavar Malka is mentioned there, and the Gemara says that Shavar Malka is really a term of endearment for Shmuel. Why? Because Shmuel paskined a lot. We even saw that in the beginning of the daf. Remember, Ma'asim b'chol yom, that Shmuel was ruling this. He was a big posek and a judge, and they call him Shavar Malka because he was like the king. It's like saying you're the king of judgments. So it probably, Rashi says here, it's a reference to Shmuel. Okay, and that's based on this Gemara in Bava Batra. In any case, what he's saying is, me and Shmuel, we're tight. We're both the best of the judges. That's what they say about me. So don't start questioning my judgment. But still, we have to, and thanks for pointing out, Ruth, right? Shmuel was an expert in monetary law, and which basically means whenever Rav and Shmuel have a debate, we always hold like Shmuel over Rav when it comes to monetary law. So he was clearly known as the expert. So now he says, I'm going to explain my ruling. You're questioning it. I'll tell you why I ruled the way I did, not because of the letter of the law. He's a serial robber. Okay, he robs all the time. And I had to penalize him in some way to get him to stop robbing. So that's why I ruled stringently, not because he really owes the shevach, but I wanted this guy to stop stealing. Again, we talked about that before, the whole thing about encouraging them to repent. Sometimes you have to punish them more in order to get them to repent. Okay, new Mishna. Gazal, and this is a Mishnah we started yesterday. We quoted part of it yesterday. Gazal behema v'izkina, avadim v'izkinu. Instead of now shevach, now what happens is the reverse. The animal decreases in value. It gets old. Or slaves, and they got old. Mishalem kashad gzela. You pay, again, you acquire it because they change. Doesn't matter, change for the good, change for the bad. And then you have to pay more in this case. Rabbi Meir omer, ba'avadim omer lo haresh chalaf. You might remember that Rav switched, who said what? We're going to get back to that later. But Rabbi Meir says, with slaves, you give them back the slave as is, because Rabbi Meir holds that slaves are like land. And if slaves are like land, land is never an exelet, it's never acquired by the thief. So that means that you just give it back as is. Now, but the rabbis think, if you remember, that slaves, and then we flipped it and said they think the opposite. But the one quoted as the rabbis here thinks that slaves are like movable property, because slaves are kind of in between. Gazal matbea v'nistak. You steal a coin and it gets a hole in it. Peirot v'yirkivu. Fruit and they rot. Yain v'chmitz. Wine and it goes bad. Mishalem kashad hagzela. So again, you take the loss and you have to pay the way it was at the time you stole it. But matbea v'nifsal. If the matbea went out of use, it's not a currency you can use anymore. Or teruma v'nitmet. Or it was teruma and it became impure. Or chametz v'alav Pesach. You had it over Pesach and now it's forbidden to benefit from. All these are problematic, but it's hezek she'eno nikar. You can't see the damage. Some sin happened, like bestiality or something. Or it was an animal meant to go on the altar and then it got disqualified. Or it had to get stoned because it had damaged, killed a person. Because this is all hezek she'eno nikar, because of that, it's not considered that it changed, and therefore you have to return it as is. Okay. This, by the way, they say is as long as you didn't if you caused the damage, well, hezek she'eno nikar, you're actually liable for, then you would obviously have to compensate. But if you didn't cause the damage, it just happened to it by somebody else, then you would be able to return it as is, even though it's worth nothing now. Okay, even though it's forbidden to benefit from and it's really worth nothing, you could return it. This we also saw in the past. So I'm Rav Pappa, lo iskina is kina mamash, elafilu kachasha. When we say it got old, we don't even only mean get old, even weakened, to which they say v'hanan iskinatzam, but it says got old. Now, got old is not something, unfortunately, that is reversible, okay? Usually it's not really reversible. So they say kachasha kigon hiskina, because kachasha is reversible, weakening. So they say we're talking about a weakening that's irreversible. Then it would be the same. Delo hadrabari, that will never get better again. Amalei Mar Kashisha, which is funny. His name is Mar Kashisha. Kashish in Hebrew is an old person. We're talking about something getting old. Mar Kashisha, the son of Rav Chisda, said to Rav Ashi, Hachi ka'amrei mishmei to Rabbi Yochanan. This is what they say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And he's going to quote exactly what we quoted before, but not in the name of Rabbi Ilah. We saw it in the name of Rabbi Ilah. He says it in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And that seems to be the whole reason why we're bringing this. Afilu ganav talev v'nasa ayel egav v'nasa shohon aseh shinoi biyado uknaos. He quotes this halakha we saw before. If the animal grows up and changes its name, there's the opposite of his kina. If it grows up and there's a name change because of the age, then we're going to say he acquires it, and therefore even tabachu machal shalo tovech shalo mocher is not going to be liable to 4 or 5. To which Amarle Rav Ashi says to Mar Kashisha, Lava minalach lo tachlif gavre. Didn't I tell you don't mess up who says what? Hahu mishmei to Rabbi Ilah itmar. That was in there, Rabbi Ilah, not Rabbi Yochanan. Get your facts straight. Okay, Rabbi Meir. That just shows us how important it is to quote something by the person who says it. See a lot of anger among the rabbis today, getting frustrated with other people that don't do things right. Rabbi Meir omer ba'avadim omer lo harei shel chalapanecha. Amar Rav Chanina bar Rav Dimi amara halakha ki Rabbi Meir. So now Rav paskins like Rabbi Meir in our Mishna that avadim are like land, and therefore they're not acquired, and therefore you return the slave as is, even if it's now old and worth less. Rav Shavik Rabbanan Ba'avik Rabbi Meir makes no sense. Why would Rav not go with the main opinion? It's usually the rabbis against an individual. We always hold by the group. So Amrei Mishum Debraita Ipchatanya. because the Braita says the opposite. So then they say, just because the Braita has the opinion switched, we usually trust the Mishnah more than the Braita. So they say, Rav switched the version of our Mishnah to match the Braita. And then he had them both say the same thing. They still ask, Mishnayot are always more reliable. So why would he switch the Mishnah to match the Braita? You should have switched the Braita to match the Mishnah. So the answer, two answers. One is Amre, Rav Nami Matnitin Ipchatniye. Rav's version of the Mishnah was different. It's not that he switched the Mishnah based on the Braita. His version of the Mishnah matched our version of the Braita that has it flipped. Okay? He had a different version of the Mishnah. That's one way to look at it. Or, we'll stop here for today. Kilo apik chad makame chad. Chad makame tarte apik. If you have a Braita against a Mishnah, this sounds like a mathematical equation. A Mishnah is stronger than a Braita. So if it's a Mishnah versus a Braita, you're going to go with the Mishnah. That wasn't the case here. Again, we don't know really, but we're suggesting. But if it's two Braitas that show that Rabbi Meir held the opposite of what Rabbi Meir holds in our Mishnah, then we say two Braitas is stronger than one Mishnah. So one Braita against the Mishnah always wins out, but two Braitas against the Mishnah, and now we're going to start with this tomorrow, a Braita that says, I actually think it's maybe a Tosefta, maybe not. But anyway, a Braita that we're going to show that Rabbi Meir holds the opposite of our Mishnah, and then we're going to say, so either he had a totally different version of our Mishnah, or he had two Braitot that said the opposite of our Mishnah, and therefore he flipped the Mishnah. Okay, that's where we're going to end today. Quick review. We started with Shmuel and some contradictory statements about how about Chob is Govesh Shevach or not, and how he returns it. Then we moved to, and we reconciled them all, we moved to Rava, and statements, questions he made about Shinuyim, what changes, and with once the Gazlan, maybe Shinu is Kone, but what about, or his Shevach, if he is Shpiach, what about someone he sells it to? And we had a bunch of different permutations of his questions. What about a gentile? Then we had a whole slew of statements of Rava and Rav Pappa about changes, Shinoi that is Kone or not Kone. And then we moved to what we infer from that last line in our Mishnah, that principle. Then we moved to the Mishnah that talked about even depreciation in value. How do we deal with that? It's also Kone, but not if it's a depreciation that's not noticeable, okay, not seen by the eye. And then we said it's not just depreciation of old, it's any kind of depreciation that won't be able to go back. And then we talked about this Rabbi Meir and how Rav paskin like Rabbi Meir, but really he didn't paskin like Rabbi Meir, really paskin like the rabbis. He just switched who said what in our Mishnah. And then we have a whole debate about that, a whole questioning about it. Why did he switch the Mishnah? Because of a Braita. And then we tried to figure out how that could be. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everybody a good day and b'savot tovot.